The wind in Copper Finch. Montana Territory had a personality. It was a mean, scraping thing that came down off the glaciers with the express purpose of peeling the newness off the town. It scoured the raw lumber of the buildings until they looked 100 years old in a season, and it carried the scent of pine and impending snow right through the chinks in the walls. The sky was so vast it felt like a weight on your shoulders, a blue so deep it could burn your eyes if you stared too long. Caleb Royce sat at a table in the far corner of Harlan's saloon, a place he'd claimed through sheer consistency. From there he could see the batwing doors and the single, grimy window that looked out onto the muddy track they called a main street. He nursed a glass of whiskey that was mostly water, his back to the wall, a habit he couldn't shake from his time as a Union scout. The years had passed, but the feeling of being watched never quite did. His face was a map of hard miles and harder sun, creased around the eyes, his mouth a straight, uncompromising line unless a rare smile broke through. He was here, in this town, clinging to the new railroad like a burr to a blanket, looking for a place that felt worth staying in. He hadn't found one yet. Harlan, the saloon's proprietor, shuffled over, wiping the bar top with a rag that had seen better decades. He was a man made of twigs and gristle, with a dry wit that Caleb appreciated. "Another one?" Royce Harlan asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Or are you just planning on making that one last until the spring thaw?" Caleb slid the glass forward a fraction of an inch, just topping it off. "Harlan, don't want to get carried away." "Wouldn't want that," the old man said, a twinkle in his eye. "A man like you, carried away, might end up somewhere interesting. Can't have that in Copper Finch. It upsets the natural order of boredom and greed." He poured a stingy measure into the glass, heard the new schoolteacher is stirring the pot. Caleb grunted, a non-committal sound. He'd seen her. Evelyn Hart. She'd arrived on the afternoon train 2 months back with a single trunk and a posture as straight as a rifle barrel. The town had taken one look at her plain, high-collared dresses and the way she never met a man's gaze for more than a second, and labeled her. She was a woman, alone, and in a place like Copper Finch, that was an invitation for speculation. They called her the Virgin, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a sneer, a title born from the severe faith she'd been raised in and a private vow she kept locked away, a shield forged from family tragedy. He'd seen her walking to the schoolhouse, a small log cabin at the edge of town, her chin held high against the whispers that followed her like stray dogs. He knew she was here for more than teaching children their letters. He'd heard the talk. She was trying to clear her mother's name, a woman accused of being a traitor years ago for helping a small band of Shoshone. And she was laying claim to a piece of land called Willow Spring. That was the real trouble, because anything to do with water in this territory was Silas Crowley's business. The next afternoon, the wind carried the sound of children's voices from the schoolhouse. Inside, Evelyn Hart stood before a dozen pupils of varying ages. The room smelled of chalk dust, damp wool, and wood smoke. She was not a conventionally pretty woman. Her face was too serious, her hands too practical. But when she spoke about history, a fire lit in her gray eyes that was more compelling than any simple beauty. "This," she said, unrolling a brittle piece of paper on her desk, "is a copy of a land deed. It is a promise. It says that the water from Willow Spring belongs to the person who first found it and used it to make a life here." A young boy with a smattering of freckles, the son of a blacksmith, raised his hand. "My PA says Mr. Crowley owns all the water now." "Your father is repeating what he has been told," Evelyn said, her voice even. "But the law, the real law, is based on what is written down, on proof. This document says the spring belonged to my mother, which means it now belongs to me. Mr. Crowley has a newer piece of paper, signed by Judge Braithwaite. But this one is older. It is the first promise." She held it up. The children stared, not at the spidery script, but at the quiet defiance in their teacher's face. She was teaching them more than reading. She was teaching them that a piece of paper, a single voice, could stand against a powerful man. It was a dangerous lesson in Copper Finch. One of the older boys, whose uncle worked as a foreman on Crowley's ranch, watched with narrowed eyes, committing every word to memory. That night, the lesson came home to roost. Evelyn was in her small room at the boarding house, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp, when the smell of smoke first pricked her nostrils. It wasn't the familiar scent of a chimney. It was sharper, angrier, acrid. She stood, her heart beginning a frantic, heavy beat against her ribs. A flicker of orange light danced beneath her door. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She grabbed the satchel containing her mother's papers, the precious copy of the deed, and threw open the window. Smoke billowed into the room, thick and choking. Below was a 10-foot drop to a muddy alley. Without a second thought, she climbed out and fell, landing hard in the muck. She scrambled to her feet, her lungs burning, and looked back. Flames were already licking at the roof of the house. This was no accident. This was a message from Silas Crowley, delivered by fire. She ran, not knowing where to go, her only thought to get away from the light and the shouting. The doors to Harlan's saloon burst open, letting in a gust of frigid air and a woman who looked like she'd been pulled through a chimney backward. Soot streaked Evelyn Hart's face. Her hair had come undone from its severe bun, and her dress was torn at the hem. She stood there for a moment, breathing in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with shock and fear. The low murmur of conversation in the saloon died instantly. Every man turned to stare. Caleb's hand, which had been halfway to his glass, stopped. He watched as her gaze swept the room, looking for something, for someone. It landed on him, in his quiet corner. There was a flicker of hesitation, then a desperate resolve settled on her features. She walked directly toward his table, her steps unsteady but purposeful, ignoring the leers and whispers that followed her. She stopped before him, clutching a leather satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. "Mr. Royce," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite the tremor running through her. Caleb said nothing, simply looked at her, waiting. "My lodgings. There was a fire. I need help." She took a breath, trying to steady herself. "I need to get to the Bitterroot Mountains. There is a midwife there, a woman named Maeve. She holds the proof I need. The original birth ledger from when she tended to my mother, and the land seal that authenticates the deed to Willow Spring." Caleb's expression didn't change. He'd spent a lifetime avoiding other people's trouble. It was the surest way to stay alive. Taking a woman, especially this woman, into the Bitterroots with a storm brewing was a fool's errand. It was inviting the very trouble he'd ridden hundreds of miles to escape. "Why me?" he asked, his voice low. "Because," Evelyn said, her gaze unwavering, "they say you are a fair man, and because you look like you know how to handle yourself when things get ugly. And I have no one else to ask." Her honesty was a straight shot, no guile to it. Still, he was about to refuse. He had his own ghosts to wrestle. He didn't need to take on hers. He opened his mouth to say no, but his eyes drifted past her, toward the swinging doors. Two men stood just outside, their silhouettes framed against the night. They were trying to look casual, but their attention was fixed on the inside of the saloon, on his table. He recognized them. Both wore the Crowley brand, figuratively speaking. The game had just changed. This wasn't a simple request anymore. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for her. He looked back at Evelyn's soot-stained face, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide behind a wall of courage. He thought of the wrong choices he'd made in his own past, the times he had followed orders when he should have followed his gut. He was trying to find a place worth staying. Maybe a place wasn't a patch of dirt on a map. Maybe it was a line you drew in that dirt, a line you refused to let men like Crowley cross. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Get your coat." A wave of relief washed over her features, so profound it nearly buckled her knees. "I have some money." "Keep it," he said, standing up. He was taller than she'd realized, his frame lean but solid. He tossed a few coins on the table. "You'll need it for supplies." As they walked toward the door, Harlan caught Caleb's eye. The old man gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, a silent warning. Caleb acknowledged it with a slight dip of his chin. He knew the risks. The coming storm was the least of them. Outside, the wind howled, whipping snow from the rooftops in ghostly swirls. The two men who had been watching melted back into the shadows of the alley as Caleb and Evelyn stepped out into the biting cold. The air was thick with the promise of a blizzard, and the night was full of enemies. Caleb felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders, the kind that came before a fight. He hadn't sought this, but it had found him, same as it always did. He took a breath of the frigid air. It felt clean after the stale smoke of the saloon. For the first time in a long time, the path ahead, though dangerous, seemed clear. Caleb led her not to the boarding house, now a chaotic scene of bucket brigades and shouting men, but to the livery stable at the far end of the street. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of hay and horse. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was calming, lighting a lantern that threw their long shadows against the rough-hewn walls. He spoke to the horses in a low murmur as he saddled his own steady buckskin and a smaller, reliable-looking mare for her. He worked without wasted motion, gathering 2 bedrolls, a sack of dried beef and hardtack, a small pot and a tin of coffee. From a dusty crate, he pulled a length of good rope, coiling it with an expert's touch before tying it to his saddle. Evelyn stood by the doorway, her borrowed cloak pulled tight, clutching her satchel. She felt useless, a spectator in her own desperate flight. Everything she owned was now either ash or in that leather bag. She was entirely dependent on this quiet, grim-faced man she barely knew. It was a terrifying feeling, a direct violation of the promise she had made to herself years ago to be beholden to no one, to never give anyone the power to break her. Yet, watching him check the cinch on her saddle for the 3rd time, she felt a flicker not of fear, but of something akin to security. He came back to her, carrying an old Spencer repeating rifle. He did not offer it to her, but slid it into the scabbard on his own saddle. He handed her the lantern. "Hold this." He turned back to his saddlebags and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. "Wrap this around your legs when you ride. The wind will try to cut right through that dress." "Thank you, Mr. Royce," she said, her voice small. "Caleb," he corrected her, not looking up. "Out here. Mister will get you a fancy funeral, not much else." They led the horses into the darkness behind the livery, avoiding the main street. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. The wind was a physical force, pushing against them, carrying the first sharp needles of snow. They mounted, and Caleb took the lead, guiding them onto a trail that skirted the edge of town and aimed for the black, serrated line of the mountains. Copper Finch and its angry, glowing heart receded behind them, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the relentless moan of the wind. They rode for hours in the dark, the landscape a world of shifting gray shadows, just as the eastern sky began to bleed a pale, bruised purple. A sound cut through the wind. It was a high, thin cry, almost lost in the gale. Caleb reined in his horse, his head cocked, listening. It came again, a sound of pure distress. He swung down from his saddle. "Stay here." He moved into a thicket of aspen, his steps silent despite the frozen ground. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. A moment later, he called to her, "Bring the horses." She found him kneeling beside a small boy, no older than 7 or 8. He was Shoshone, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his small leg caught in the cruel steel jaws of a trap. It was a trapper's set, half hidden in the snow, meant for a wolf or a coyote. Caleb was speaking to him in a low, calm voice, using a mix of English and what Evelyn guessed were Shoshone words. "It is all right, son. We will get you out." He looked up at Evelyn. "In my right saddlebag, a canvas roll. Bring it." She fumbled with the buckle, her fingers numb with cold. She brought him the roll, and he spread it open on the snow. It contained a few simple, clean instruments, a knife, a pair of probes, and strips of clean linen. He worked carefully, using a sturdy branch to pry the trap's jaws open just enough. The boy cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and then his leg was free. The wound was ugly, bleeding sluggishly onto the snow. Caleb cleaned it with water from his canteen and a bit of whiskey that made the boy hiss. He wrapped it tightly with the linen. As he finished, 3 riders emerged from the trees. As silent as the falling snow, they were Shoshone warriors, their faces impassive, their eyes hard. One held a rifle across his lap. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Caleb did not reach for his gun. He simply stood up slowly, raising one hand, palm open. The lead rider, a woman with graying braids and eyes that had seen a great deal, dismounted. She looked at the boy, at the bandage on his leg, and then at Caleb. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Royce," she said. Her voice was like stones smoothed by a river. "Tala," Caleb replied, his voice even. "He was caught in a trap. The bone is not broken. I do not think—" The woman, Tala Gray, knelt and examined the boy's leg with gentle, knowing hands. She looked at Caleb again. "You were a scout. You drew maps for the soldiers. It was not a question." "A long time ago," he said. "Your maps led them to our winter camps," she stated, her voice flat, without accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "I drew the land as I saw it," Caleb said, his own voice tight. "I did not choose the destination." Tala held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. She turned her attention back to the boy, who was now leaning against her. She looked at Evelyn, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You travel with him into the storm. You are either very brave or very foolish." She took a small leather pouch from her belt and handed it to Caleb. "For fever, brew it in hot water. The snow will be deep in the passes." She said something to the other men in their language. One of them dismounted and gently lifted the boy onto his horse. Tala mounted her own pony. "Crowley's men set these traps now," she said, looking back at them. "They do not care what they catch." With a final, unreadable look at Caleb, she and her companions melted back into the woods, leaving only the tracks of their horses and a single, dark patch of blood on the snow. They rode on, the encounter leaving a heavy silence between them. Evelyn watched Caleb's straight back, her mind racing. He was a man of contradictions, a former scout for the army that had hunted these people. Yet he knew their language and their healers. He had a past far darker and more complex than she could have imagined. That night, they made a cold camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang. The wind shrieked overhead, but in their small refuge, it was almost peaceful. Caleb built a small, smokeless fire that provided a meager warmth. He hung the lantern on a knob of rock, and its steady, golden glow pushed back the oppressive darkness. It was a tiny beacon of civilization in a wild, unforgiving world. He made coffee and heated some beans in the pot. He handed her a tin plate. "It's not much," he said. "It is more than I had a few hours ago," she said honestly. She ate, the warmth of the food spreading through her. They sat in silence for a while. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the storm. "Mr. Royce, Caleb," she began, her voice hesitant. He had saved a child. He had faced down armed men without flinching. He had shown her a quiet, practical kindness. She had to give him the whole truth. It was a risk, a terrifying leap of faith. But he had earned it. "Willow Spring," she said, looking into the fire. "It is not just about the water rights." He waited, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "My mother found more than water there. She was a naturalist. She studied rocks. She found silver, placer deposits, all through the gravel bed beneath the spring. Not a great vein, but enough to make a man rich. She kept it a secret. She knew what a silver strike would do, the greed, the violence. She said the water was life, but the silver would only bring death." Caleb stared at her, his jaw tightening. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a land grab, it was a treasure hunt. Crowley wasn't just a bully, he was a thief aiming for a fortune. And that made him infinitely more dangerous. She knew someone would find out eventually. Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. She registered the land seal to protect the water, believing it was the only thing of true value. She thought the silver was a curse. Caleb stood up and walked to the edge of their shelter, staring out into the swirling snow. This changed everything. He had signed on to help a schoolteacher right a wrong. He was now guarding a silver map. Men like Crowley did not stop for anything when silver was involved. They killed, they burned, they tore the world apart. He had seen it before. He had been a part of it before, drawing the maps that led men to places they would desecrate for profit. The bitter taste of a past mistake rose in his throat. He had sworn he would never again be the instrument of another man's greed. He turned back to her, his face a hard mask. "You should have told me." "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I am always afraid. I promised myself I would be strong, that I would rely on no one. It is the only way to stay safe, but I cannot do this alone." He looked at her, this woman of iron principles and profound vulnerability, and felt a wall go up inside him. He would see her to the bitter roots. He had given his word. But he would keep his distance. Getting involved, truly involved, was how you ended up making mistakes you could never outrun. He picked up his bedroll and laid it on the far side of the fire, a clear and deliberate space between them. Evelyn watched him, a knot of disappointment tightening in her chest. She had offered him her trust, the most valuable thing she possessed, and he had retreated from it. The small warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, extinguished by the cold truth of what they were up against. She wrapped herself in her own bedroll, the rope on Caleb's saddle a dark, coiled shape in the firelight. It seemed to represent everything that lay between them, a lifeline, a restraint, a tie that bound them together on this perilous journey, whether they liked it or not. Outside, a lone wolf howled, its voice a perfect echo of the desolation in her own heart. The dawn that followed was a study in gray. The fire had died to sullen embers, and the distance Caleb had put between them felt as cold and vast as the landscape. They broke their fast with cold beef and colder silence, the unspoken truth about the silver hanging in the air. Evelyn felt a sharp pang of regret, not for telling him, but for the consequence. She had wanted a partner, and in her fear, she had created a guard. As they rode higher into the mountains, the trail narrowed and the snow deepened. The world became a vertical, monochromatic place of rock, pine, and snow. The wind had a new voice up here, a high, keening sound that scraped at the nerves. Caleb seemed a part of the landscape, his shoulders set against the gale, his eyes constantly scanning the treacherous terrain. Evelyn, however, felt every punishing mile. Her muscles ached, and her hands, raw from the cold, struggled to maintain a firm grip on the reins. After a few hours, Caleb stopped in a relatively sheltered bowl of rock. He dismounted and turned to her, his face impassive. "You need to know how to use this," he said, pulling the Spencer rifle from its scabbard. "I might fall. I might get shot. If that happens, you running will not help. You will need to fight." He handed the weapon to her. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, cold weight of wood and steel. "It is loaded with 7 rounds. You work the lever like this. See, it ejects the spent casing and chambers a new one. Do not pull the trigger unless you mean to hit what you are aiming at. A wasted shot is a loud announcement of your position." He set up a pine cone on a distant rock. "Try it." Evelyn raised the rifle, her arms trembling from the weight and the cold. It felt alien in her hands, a tool of violence. She, who had only ever wielded books and chalk. She sighted down the barrel, lined up the sights with the pine cone as he had shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a brutal crack that sent a shockwave up her arm and into her shoulder. The rifle bucked hard against her, and the shot went wild, kicking up a puff of snow a yard to the left of the target. Her ears rang. "Hold it tighter to your shoulder," Caleb said, his voice flat. "Let your body take the kick. Do not be afraid of it. Try again." She reloaded, her movements clumsy. She took a deep breath, pressed the stock firmly into her shoulder, aimed, and fired. This time the pine cone disintegrated. A small, fierce satisfaction bloomed in her chest. She looked at Caleb. "Good," was all he said. Taking the rifle back. "Now, your saddle. The cinch needs to be tight enough that 2 fingers can just barely fit under it. Any looser and it will slip. Any tighter and you will hurt the horse." He made her unsaddle the mare and do it herself. Her fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the leather straps. He watched without comment, his patience a silent, demanding presence. When she finally finished, he checked her work and gave a curt nod. For the rest of the day, he pointed out things she had never noticed, the way a bent twig could signal the recent passage of a deer, how the color of the snow in the shadows could indicate deep ice. She was a student again, but the classroom was the whole hostile world, and the price of failure was no longer a poor grade. They were picking their way through a narrow canyon late in the afternoon when the world seemed to groan. It started as a low rumble that vibrated up through the horse's hooves. Caleb reined in sharply, his head snapping up toward the canyon rim. "Get back," he yelled, yanking on her mare's reins, pulling the horse back on its haunches. A cascade of rocks and snow peeled away from the cliff face above them, a horrifying, unstoppable river of debris. Boulders the size of wagons crashed down, shattering on the canyon floor with a sound like cannon fire. The air filled with a choking cloud of rock dust and snow. It was over in seconds. Where the trail had been, there was now a massive, impassable wall of broken stone. They were trapped. "We cannot go back," Caleb said, his voice grim as he surveyed the rock slide. "The storm is coming in too fast behind us. We would never make it out of the high country." He pointed to a faint, barely visible track leading up the steep canyon wall. "There. An old goat trail. It will take us over the ridge. It is our only way." The climb was terrifying. The trail was a sliver of icy rock, and the wind threatened to tear them from the mountainside. The horses, sensing the danger, trembled and snorted, their hooves slipping precariously close to the edge. Evelyn forced herself to breathe, to trust her horse, to trust the quiet man leading them. By the time they reached the top of the ridge, the storm had broken upon them in its full fury. The world dissolved into a blinding, horizontal blur of white. The wind was a physical beast, screaming and clawing at them. Visibility dropped to near zero. "There is an old mining camp a mile north of here," Caleb shouted over the roar. "We have to find it." It felt like an eternity, a desperate, frozen struggle against the elements. Evelyn lost all sense of direction, all sense of time, trusting only the dark shape of Caleb's horse in the swirling chaos ahead. Just when she thought she could go no further, that she would simply freeze and fall from her saddle, a collection of dilapidated shapes loomed out of the whiteout. A few log cabins, their roofs caved in, their windows like vacant eyes. The abandoned mining camp. Caleb practically pulled her from her horse and half-carried her to the most intact of the shacks. He shoved the door open, and they stumbled inside, out of the storm's immediate fury. They led the horses into the relative shelter of an attached lean-to. Inside the cabin, the wind still whistled through 100 gaps in the walls, but it was a refuge. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they saw they were not alone. A man was lying on a makeshift cot in the corner, a colorful serape pulled up to his chin. His face was pale with pain, and his leg was crudely splinted with broken floorboards. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his dark eyes wary. "Buenos tardes," he said, his voice strained. "I fear the mountain has claimed my mule and my cargo. I am Señor Valdez." Caleb moved toward him, his earlier coldness replaced by a focused concern. "What happened?" "The rock slide," Valdez said, gesturing to his leg. "The same one that trapped you, I imagine. My leg is broken. I was fortunate to crawl here before the storm hit." Caleb knelt beside him, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined the leg. "The bone is broken badly. We need to set it properly, or you will lose the leg." He looked at Evelyn. "I will need your help. Hold the lantern steady, and talk to him, keep him from thinking about the pain. What followed was a grim, focused ordeal. Caleb, using Valdez's own knife sterilized in the flame of the lantern and a healthy dose of whiskey for both patient and surgeon, worked with a steady hand. Evelyn found herself holding the light, her stomach churning, but her hand did not shake. She spoke to Señor Valdez, telling him about the books she had read, about the sea she had seen once as a child. Anything to distract him from the brutal reality of what was happening in the dim, freezing cabin. Caleb's face was a mask of concentration, the scout and field medic from his past taking over completely. When it was done, the leg was set straight in a new, more secure splint, and Valdez, pale and sweating, was propped up against the wall. He took a long swallow from the whiskey bottle Caleb offered him. "I am in your debt, sir. A debt I will repay. You should know who you are running from. Crowley is not a man who uses only local talent. He has hired Pinkerton agents." The name landed in the small cabin like a physical blow. Pinkertons. They were relentless. A private army with the reach and authority of the federal government. They were not simple thugs. They were professionals. "They arrived in Copperfinch the day you left," Valdez continued, his voice low. "They are telling everyone the woman is a dangerous agitator, a troublemaker stirring up the natives. Judge Braithwaite has already signed a warrant for her arrest, for inciting a riot and for the arson of the boarding house." Evelyn stared at him, horrified, but they set the fire. "Truth is a matter of who has the loudest voice and the most guns, Señorita," Valdez said wearily. "And in this territory, Crowley and the railroad have both." Caleb stood, the lines around his mouth tightening. His past was rushing back to meet him. He had seen what organizations like the Pinkertons did. They operated under the color of law, but their methods were brutal and absolute. He felt a familiar, sickening feeling, the same one he'd had when he'd handed his maps over to a cavalry officer, knowing, deep down, that they would be used for something terrible. Later, after Valdez had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Caleb busied himself making coffee. He dumped a handful of grounds into the pot with water and set it on the small fire he had managed to build in the dilapidated hearth. The resulting brew was thick, black, and punishingly bitter. He handed a cup to Evelyn. She took a sip and winced. From the corner, a weak voice piped up, "Por Dios, my friend, you saved my leg only to try and poison me with this battery acid." Caleb looked over at Valdez, who was watching him with a pained but amused expression. "It is coffee," Caleb said defensively. "My friend," Valdez said, "that is an insult to the bean. Let me tell you how it is done. You must toast the beans first, just a little, to wake them up. Then you bring the water to a boil, take it off the fire, and then add the grounds. Let them sit. Be patient. Coffee, like a beautiful woman, cannot be rushed." A small smile touched Evelyn's lips. "He has a point, Caleb. This could be used to tan hides." Caleb looked at the cup in his hand, then at her, and a flicker of something other than grim resolve crossed his face. A reluctant, wry humor. "I was a scout, not a chef." The small moment of shared laughter was a fragile thing in the face of the howling storm and the grim news they had received. It did not last long. The cabin grew quiet again. The wind howled its mournful song. Evelyn watched Caleb as he stared into the flames. The firelight carved deep shadows on his face, making him look older, haunted. "The war," she said softly, not a question, but a statement. He did not look at her. "Sometimes," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I still hear the sound of the axes. The men were ordered to clear a forest for a sight line. They took down every tree. When they were done, it was just a field of stumps, and there was nowhere left to hide." He fell silent, but she understood. He was a man who had seen the world torn down, and now he was hiding in his own forest of silence. But for the first time, he had let her see one of the stumps. She looked down at her own hands, chapped and sore, but steady. She had held the lantern. She had not looked away. Outside, the snow was burying the world, erasing all tracks, all paths. But inside the small, broken cabin, something new was being forged. The next morning, when the storm had passed, she saw it when she stepped outside. Her own boot prints in the fresh snow were clear and distinct, right beside the deeper, surer marks of his. They were walking side by side. They left the mining shack at first light, leaving behind a grateful and recovering Señor Valdez, who insisted Caleb take a small, well-balanced knife as a token of his thanks. The world was newborn, draped in a thick, immaculate blanket of white. The storm had scoured the air clean, and the sky was a painful, brilliant blue. Every pine bough was heavy with snow, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. But the beauty of the scene did nothing to warm the chill that had settled between Caleb and Evelyn. The knowledge of the silver, of the Pinkertons, of the warrant for her arrest, had changed the very air they breathed. They were no longer just a man and a woman on a difficult journey. They were guardians of a secret, fugitives from a manufactured law. Evelyn rode with a new straightness in her spine. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a layer of hard resolve. She was no longer just the protected. She was a participant. She watched the trail, her eyes scanning the snow for any track that was not their own, her hand resting near the satchel that contained her past and her future. Caleb had retreated even further into himself. The news of the Pinkertons had stirred ghosts he thought he had left buried in the mud of old battlefields. He rode with a grim economy of motion, his gaze sweeping not just the path ahead but the high ridges, the dark stands of timber, any place a man with a rifle might wait. He was a scout again, and the weight of that old skin was heavy. They followed a creek bed downward, moving out of the high wind-blasted peaks into a more sheltered country of rolling hills and dense forest. After 2 days of hard travel, Caleb reined in his horse at the mouth of what looked like an impassable wall of rock, a sheer cliff face choked with ancient firs. "The valley is through there," he said, pointing to a nearly invisible fissure in the rock, a crack barely wide enough for a horse to pass through. The passage was claustrophobic, the rock walls close enough to touch on either side. It opened abruptly into a place that seemed to belong to a different world. The valley was a perfect bowl, shielded on all sides by the towering mountains. "Here," the wind was a gentle whisper, not a scream. A small, clear stream meandered through a meadow dotted with the frosted skeletons of last summer's wildflowers. A plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney of a small, sturdy cabin built of river rock and thick logs, looking as though it had grown right out of the earth. An old woman was chopping wood by the side of the cabin, her movements strong and sure despite her age. Her face was a web of deep lines, her hair a long, silver braid. She stopped her work as they approached, resting the axe head on the chopping block, and watched them with eyes that were as clear and sharp as the winter air. She did not look afraid. She looked immovable. "That is a hard trail to find for folks who do not know it is there," she said, her voice a low rasp. Her gaze lingered on Evelyn. "You have your mother's eyes." Relief, so potent it made her feel dizzy, washed over Evelyn. "You are Maeve." "I am," the old woman said, "and I have been expecting someone to come asking about Sarah Hart for a long time. Get down. Bring the horses to the lean-to. You look half frozen." Inside, the cabin was one room, warm and filled with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. Maeve moved with a purpose, ladling a thick stew into 2 bowls and setting them on a small, scarred wooden table. They ate in silence at first, the warmth of the food a balm to their weary bodies. When they were finished, Evelyn finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she explained everything. The fire, the warrant, Crowley's claim, the lie that had shadowed her whole life. Maeve listened without interruption, her expression giving nothing away. When Evelyn was done, the old midwife simply nodded. "Sarah was a good woman," she said, "a brave one. She did not see the world in terms of white or native. She saw people who were hurt, and she helped them. The men who came after her called that treason. I called it decency." Maeve went to a large wooden chest in the corner and lifted the heavy lid. From beneath a pile of old quilts, she pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger and a heavy, brass object. She placed them on the table. "This is my birthing book," she said, her hand resting on the ledger. "Every child I brought into this world in these mountains is in here. And this," she said, tapping the brass object, "is the territorial land seal. Sarah asked me to keep it with the book. She said they told the same story." With hands that were not quite steady, Evelyn opened the ledger. The pages were filled with a neat, spidery script, a record of lives begun in this harsh, beautiful land. She found the entry for her mother. It was all there. The date of the claim, the description of Willow Spring, and beneath it, a clear, firm impression of the land seal. It was the proof, the undeniable, legal truth. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of vindication, of a lifetime of sorrow finally finding a release. Her mother was not a traitor. She was a healer. Caleb stood back, giving her the moment. He felt a quiet satisfaction. This was a good thing, a piece of justice in a world that had precious little of it. He watched as Evelyn traced the words with her finger, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, for his own peace of mind, to be sure of what they held. He stepped forward and looked down at the page. He saw the entry, the seal, the neat handwriting, but then he saw something else. In the margin, next to the date, was a small, almost unnoticeable notation. It was the name of a cavalry officer, Lieutenant Miller, and the number of his unit, 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol. The air left Caleb's lungs in a rush. The warm, quiet cabin vanished, replaced by a memory so vivid it stole his breath. He was 20 years old again, his face raw from the wind, the smell of pine and cold leather in his nostrils. He was standing beside that same lieutenant, unrolling a map on the flat of his saddle, a map he had drawn. "There is a small, hidden camp here, sir," his younger self was saying, pointing to a spot on the paper, Shoshone, mostly women and children from the looks of it. "They seem to be peaceful." "Peaceful does not matter, Scout," the lieutenant had said, his eyes cold. "Orders are to clear this entire sector. Collaborators will be treated as hostiles." Caleb stared at the ledger, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. That raid, it had been a mistake, a piece of bad intelligence filtered through a command that was hungry for results. They had descended on a camp of innocents. He had not fired a shot. He had been a mile away, scouting the next ridge. But he had drawn the map. He had led them there. And Sarah Hart, for the crime of tending to the wounded survivors of that raid, had been branded a traitor. The official report had called her a collaborator, an accomplice who had given aid to hostiles. It was his work, his map, that had started the chain of events that destroyed her life and now threatened her daughters. Caleb Evelyn's voice pulled him back. She had looked up, her tears subsiding, and saw the color drain from his face. "What is it? What is wrong?" He could not speak for a moment. The guilt was a physical thing, choking him. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and she saw in them a bleakness, a self-loathing so profound it made her take a step back. "This date," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The raid on the Shoshone camp. The one your mother helped the survivors of." He swallowed, the words tasting like ash. "That was my unit. I was the scout who mapped this territory for them." Evelyn stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. It did not make sense. This man, who had protected her, who had shown her a quiet kindness, who had just shared in her moment of triumph, it was impossible. You were one of them," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. "I did not pull a trigger," he said, his voice flat and dead. "But I drew the map, I showed them the way." The truth landed, shattering the fragile trust that had been growing between them. The man who had been her savior was also the architect of her family's ruin. The irony was so cruel, so monstrous. It stole the air from her lungs. She looked at his face, at the lines of a past he never spoke of, and suddenly they were not lines of quiet strength, but marks of a terrible guilt he had carried all these years. The shared journey, the moments of understanding, it all felt like a lie. "Get away from me," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. "Do not touch those papers! Do not touch me!" He took a step back, his hands raised slightly, as if to show he was unarmed, that he was no threat. But he was a threat. His very presence was a desecration of her mother's memory. "Evelyn, He started, but he had no words. There was nothing to say. "I want you to leave," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle strength. "Our arrangement is over. I will find my own way back." "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a stone settling. "I gave my word I would see you and these papers back to Copper Finch. I am going to do that." "I will not travel with you," she cried, the betrayal a raw wound. "You can hate me. You can shoot me when we get there. I would not blame you," he said, his eyes holding hers, his own pain a vast, empty landscape. "But those men, the Pinkertons, they are still out there. And I am the man who started this. I will be the one to finish it." They left the Valley of Peace and plunged back into a world of conflict, both external and internal. The tension between them was a third presence, a silent, screaming passenger. The sun, which had seemed so bright and hopeful, now felt harsh, its light exposing the raw ugliness of the truth. It beat down on the snow, and the world began to weep. The pristine white began to melt, turning the trails to slush and mud. The sound of running water was everywhere, a low gurgle that grew steadily into a roar. They came to a gorge that was spanned by a long, rickety wooden bridge. Below, a river, swollen with melted snow and ice, raged against its banks, a churning, brown torrent. They had a pack-horse with them, carrying what was left of their supplies and Maeve's generous contribution of dried meat and blankets. Caleb went first, testing the bridge's stability. It groaned under his horse's weight. He made it across and turned, signaling for her to follow. She urged her mare forward, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with the man on the other side. As she reached the middle of the bridge, a sound like thunder echoed through the gorge. It was not a storm. It was a flash flood. A wall of water, a churning mass of mud, uprooted trees, and grinding ice came roaring down the canyon. The bridge shuddered violently. The pack-horse, terrified, reared back, its scream a thin, hopeless sound against the deluge. The ropes holding their supplies snapped, and the horse was swept away, swallowed by the violent water. The bridge beneath Evelyn began to splinter, to break apart. She saw Caleb moving, a blur of action. He had the rope from his saddle, the coil a familiar shape in his hand. He threw it, the loop unfurling across the chasm. He shouted something she could not hear over the roar. The boards beneath her mare gave way. The horse fell, and Evelyn was thrown clear, landing hard on the last few feet of the collapsing bridge. She scrabbled for purchase as the world dissolved around her, the river reaching up to claim her. Then the rope was there, a solid, real thing in her hands. She clung to it as the last of the bridge was torn away, and she was left dangling over the raging torrent, held only by the rope and by the man on the other side, the man who was both her protector and her deepest wound. The rope burned Evelyn's hands. It was a rough, biting friction against her frozen skin, the only thing tethering her to the world. Below, the river was a nightmare of sound and fury, a hungry, grinding monster of water and ice that had swallowed her horse and the last of their supplies. Above, there was only the gray sky and the man who was the source of all her pain and her only hope for survival. She watched him, not as a woman watching a man, but as a creature at the edge of an abyss, watching the anchor point of its salvation. His boots were dug into the muddy bank, his body braced, every line of his form a study in raw, physical strain. The rope was wrapped around his waist, and he was taking it in, hand over hand, his knuckles white, his jaw set like granite, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and corded under his worn shirt. He did not speak, did not waste breath. He just pulled. She tried to help, tried to find a foothold on the crumbling vertical cliff face, but the rock was slick with spray and loose dirt. Her boots scrabbled uselessly, Her entire weight was on him. She felt a surge of despair, a feeling that she was just another burden for this man to carry, another sin for him to atone for. The thought was so bitter it almost made her let go. Then his eyes met hers across the 20 feet of rope that separated them. They were not cold, not distant. They were blazing with a fierce, concentrated effort. In them, she saw no judgment, no resentment. She saw only an absolute, unbreakable will. He was not just saving her life. He was refusing to let her die. He hauled her over the edge, and she collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping, her lungs on fire. For a long moment, they both just lay there, a few feet apart, listening to the roar of the river and the frantic hammering of their own hearts. He had not just saved her. He had pulled her from her own grave. The knowledge was a heavy, complicated thing, and it settled in the silence between them. The journey to Willow Spring took another full day. They had lost everything but the clothes on their backs, the rifle, his knife, and the precious oilskin-wrapped satchel Evelyn had managed to keep slung over her shoulder through the entire ordeal. The ledger and the seal were safe. They walked, leading Caleb's single, weary horse. The silence was different now. It was no longer the sharp-edged silence of anger and betrayal. It was a deep, quiet space, filled with the unspoken weight of what had passed between them. He had drawn the map that led to her mother's ruin, and he had held the rope that kept her from her own. How could one person be both those things? They saw it at dusk. A gentle depression in the land, a place where the grass stayed green longer than anywhere else, sheltered by a small grove of aspen and willow. Water bubbled up from the ground, clear and cold, forming a small, deep pool before trickling away to form a creek. It was a place of profound peace, Willow Spring. It was more beautiful, more alive than she had ever imagined. For a moment, seeing it, the weariness and the fear fell away from Evelyn. This was what her mother had loved, what she had died to protect. Caleb saw the look on her face, the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her eyes softened. He saw the sanctuary in this place, and it made the back of his neck prickle. Sanctuaries were the easiest places to get ambushed. "We will rest here," he said, his voice low, "but we keep watch." They made a small, hidden camp back in the trees, out of sight of the spring itself. They had nothing to eat, and the cold was setting in. As darkness fell, a profound exhaustion settled over them. They had been running for days. Caleb took the first watch, sitting with his back against a tree, the Spencer across his lap, his gaze fixed on the shadows. Evelyn tried to sleep, but her mind would not rest. She clutched the satchel, the physical proof of her quest, but the man sitting 20 feet away was the living proof of its cost. She drifted into a light, uneasy doze, and in that vulnerable state, the attack came. It was not a sound that woke her, but a sudden absence of it. The gentle night noises of the grove had ceased. She opened her eyes to see Caleb already on his feet, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of their fire. Then the shadows around them moved. There were 3 of them. They were not Crowley's usual ranch hands. These men moved with a quiet, predatory efficiency. Pinkertons. They were on them before Caleb could even raise the rifle. One man slammed the butt of his pistol into the side of Caleb's head, and he went down with a grunt. Another grabbed Evelyn. His hand clamped cruelly over her mouth. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward the spring, his partner following, keeping a pistol aimed at Caleb's unmoving form. "Where is it?" the man holding her snarled in her ear, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "The book, the seal. Crowley wants them." "I do not know what you are talking about," she gasped, the words muffled. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way." He shoved her to her knees in the damp earth beside the pool. He took a length of rough rope from his belt. "We heard you were a proper lady. Let us see how proper you are after a few hours tied to a tree in the freezing cold." He yanked her hands behind her back and began to bind her wrists, pulling the rope brutally tight. The fibers bit into her skin, and she cried out in pain. "The ledger," he repeated. "Tell us where it is, and this all stops." Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness, from the wrong direction, from the far side of the spring. "Looking for me." The two men spun around, pistols raised. Caleb was standing there, blood trickling from a cut on his temple, his hands empty and raised to show he was no threat. "Stay where you are, Royce!" the first man barked, his pistol unwavering. "I am not going anywhere," Caleb said, his voice calm. "But you are a long way from the railroad, boys. You know who else uses these woods, Tala Gray and her people? They do not take kindly to armed strangers who set traps near their hunting grounds." The second man glanced nervously into the dark trees. Caleb's words had planted a seed of doubt. "He is bluffing," the first man said, but his own eyes flickered toward the darkness. That flicker was all Caleb needed. In one fluid motion, he dropped to the ground, and the night exploded. He had not been unarmed. Senor Valdez's knife, which he had palmed while on the ground, flew through the air, a silver streak in the moonlight. It struck the second man's gun hand, and the man screamed, his pistol clattering on the rocks. In the same instant, Caleb launched himself forward, not at the first man, but at a large, loose boulder at the edge of the pool. He heaved it with all his strength. It crashed into the water, sending up a massive spray that soaked the first man, blinding him for a crucial second. Caleb was on him, not with fists, but with a cold, brutal efficiency. A sharp blow to the throat, another to the temple. The man collapsed without a sound. The second Pinkerton, clutching his bleeding hand, had already scrambled into the darkness and was gone. The silence that descended was absolute. Caleb stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly receding. He went to Evelyn and knelt before her, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. She was shaking, more from the shock and violation than the cold. Her hands were bound so tightly the rope had broken the skin. He took out his knife to cut the ropes, but she flinched. "No," she whispered, her voice a thread. She looked at her own hands, then at his, the hands that had drawn a map, thrown a knife, and now were about to set her free. Everything, the entire journey, the pain, the fear, the impossible connection between them seemed to be held in that single taut length of rope. She had spent a lifetime tying herself in knots of duty and denial, of being the untouchable woman, the virgin. It had been her armor, but it had also been her cage. And in the clear, cold air of Willow Spring, she finally understood that true strength was not in being unbreakable, but in having the courage to be vulnerable. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the warring emotions. He waited, his hands still. She took a shaky breath. "Untie me slowly," she whispered. The words were for her raw, aching wrists, but they were for so much more. They were a plea for tenderness in a world that had offered none. It was an admission, an invitation. A tremor went through Caleb's powerful frame. He had lived for years with the weight of his guilt, a self-imposed exile. He had offered his protection, his skill, his life if necessary, all as a form of payment for an old debt. But this, her quiet request, was not something he could earn or fight for. It was something being freely given. It was trust. It was grace. He reached out, his calloused, blood-stained fingers gently taking hold of the knot. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the rough fibers of the rope, the shocking warmth of her skin beneath. He began to work the knot loose, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He could feel the slight tremor in her hands. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. The only sound was the soft whisper of the rope as he worked it, and the quiet crackle of the distant fire. He felt her hand shift, her fingers gently coming to rest on the back of his. A simple touch. It was not a romantic gesture. It was a connection, an anchor. And it broke through the last of his defenses. The guilt, the loneliness, the long, hard miles. It all crested in a wave of emotion so powerful it stole his breath. "God," he said, his voice thick, choked with everything he could not say, "I am already yours." The words hung in the silent air between them, a vow spoken not in a church, but in a wilderness, under the cold witness of the stars. It was a surrender, a confession of a truth he had not even admitted to himself until that moment. The last knot came free and the rope fell away. He gently took her hands, turning them over to examine the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the scout, the killer, the protector, and the lonely man, all laid bare. A long moment passed. The intensity of it was a current, a living thing, and then a small, watery smile touched Evelyn's lips. "You still have to learn how to make good coffee," she said, her voice soft but steady, "before you truly belong to anyone." A short, rough sound escaped Caleb's throat. It was a laugh, a real, genuine laugh. It was a rusty sound, like a hinge that had not been used in a long time. But it was there. He laughed, and she smiled, and the terrible tension of the night finally broke, washed away by the clean, clear water of Willow Spring. They sat by the fire for a long time after that, not touching, but closer than they had ever been. The shared moment had changed the landscape between them. The chasm of betrayal and guilt was still there, but now a bridge had been thrown across it, a fragile span built of a whispered plea and a choked confession. "We cannot win this with guns," she said finally, looking into the flames. "There will always be more of them. More Pinkertons, more men like that." "I know," he said. "Violence is their language. We have to speak a different one." "The truth," she said, her hand instinctively going to the satchel. "The ledger. Your testimony. We go back to Copper Finch and we face them. Not in the shadows, but in the open, in the courthouse." He nodded, a new, clear purpose settling in his eyes. "We will use their own laws against them. We will give the town a choice. They can stand with a thief and his hired guns, or they can stand with a piece of paper and the truth." It was a desperate plan, a fool's hope, but it was their only one. And for the first time, as they sat together in the quiet dark, it felt like it might be enough. They were no longer a guard in his charge. They were partners. And they were going to walk back into the heart of the trouble they had fled. Together. The aftermath of a storm, whether of snow or of violence, is a period of quiet, muddy work. Copper Finch did not heal overnight. The wound that Silas Crowley and Judge Braithwaite had carved into its heart was deep, and it closed slowly, stitched together with sweat and timber and a new, fragile kind of trust. The weeks that followed the courthouse showdown were defined not by shouting, but by the rhythmic thud of hammers and the scrape of shovels. Caleb's self-imposed sentence began at the gorge where the bridge had been washed away. He did not work alone. The town's blacksmith, a man whose respect Caleb had earned not with a gun, but with his confession, was there every morning, his powerful arms making the timbers sing. Other men joined them, ranchers and shopkeepers who had once stood silently on the sidelines. They came first out of a sense of civic duty, then out of a grudging respect for the quiet, relentless man who worked harder and longer than any of them. They did not speak of the raid or of the maps. They spoke of the proper way to set a support beam, of the coming winter, of the price of beef. Through the shared language of labor, Caleb began to build something more than a bridge. He was building a place for himself in the community he had nearly destroyed. While Caleb rebuilt the physical connection to the outside world, Evelyn worked to restore the town's soul. She did not move back into the rebuilt boarding house. Instead, with the help of a few of the townswomen, she erected a small, sturdy cabin near the willows that gave the spring its name. It was hers, a home she had chosen, not a room she was renting. She was no longer a visitor, a transient teacher with a shadowed past. She was the guardian of Willow Spring, and she took the responsibility with a seriousness that reshaped her entire being. Her first official act was to post a large, carefully lettered board near the pool. At the top, it read, "The Water of Willow Spring." Below, in neat columns, was a ledger. She decreed that during the dry months, every family, every rancher, could draw a fair and equal share of water. Every bucket drawn was to be noted in the book for all to see. There would be no secret deals, no hoarding. The water was life, and life, she believed, should be shared. At first, the ranchers were skeptical. One of the larger landowners, a man named Peterson who had been a staunch Crowley supporter, rode out to see her, his face a mask of suspicion. "So you own it now? Is that it, Miss Hart?" he asked, his tone challenging. "We just traded one water baron for another." Evelyn did not rise to the bait. She simply pointed to the ledger. "Your name is here, Mr. Peterson, same as everyone else's. Your share is the same as the blacksmith's. The water belongs to the land, and we all live on the land. This book is just to make sure we are all good neighbors to each other." He stared at the board, then at her calm, steady face. He had expected a fight or a sermon. He had not expected simple, unadorned fairness. He grunted, turned his horse, and rode away. The next day, his foreman came and quietly marked his share in the book. Evelyn had won her first battle as a leader not with a document or a weapon, but with an idea. The schoolhouse reopened a month after the trial. The broken windows were replaced, the bullet hole in the ceiling was patched, and the whole room smelled of fresh pine sawdust and beeswax polish. When the children took their seats, they saw something new hanging beside the teacher's desk. It was a thick, braided rope, its ends neatly tied. It ran up to a small bell mounted on the roof. The lesson that first day was not on arithmetic, but on history. The town's history. A young girl, the blacksmith's daughter, stood at the front of the class and recited a short poem she had written. The town was dark, the truth was lost, she read, her small voice clear and proud, and greed demanded a final cost. But one small light, a steady flame, was placed to show who was to blame. A lantern's glow, a single spark can chase away the deepest dark. The children listened, their faces rapt. The events at the courthouse were no longer a frightening, confusing memory. They were a story, a lesson, a founding myth for a town that was just now learning what it truly meant to be a community. Caleb's days were long and physically punishing, but in the evenings, he would often walk the 2 miles from the bridge camp to Evelyn's cabin. She would have a simple supper waiting. They did not speak much of the past. They spoke of the present, of the slow, steady progress on the bridge, of a student who was struggling with his letters. They were learning a new language together, a quiet, domestic dialect of shared glances and comfortable silences. One evening, he arrived to find her laughing, a rare and beautiful sound. She was holding a letter from Senor Valdez. He had made it to a larger town down the railway line, was recovering well, and had sent a large sack of what he claimed were the finest coffee beans north of the Rio Grande, along with meticulous, handwritten instructions on their proper preparation. "It seems your reputation has spread," she teased, her eyes sparkling. Caleb looked at the sack of beans with a wary expression. A man should stick to what he knows. Building bridges, tracking. I am no good at the finer things. His humility was put to a very public test a few weeks later. To celebrate the nearing completion of the bridge, the town held a potluck picnic. There was music, dancing, and a fiercely competitive bean cooking contest. Caleb, prodded by a few of the men from the work crew, entered his standard camp recipe beans, molasses, and a bit of salt pork, simmered for hours. He was quietly confident. It was the food that had sustained him for years in the wilderness. He lost, decisively. The winner was a 10-year-old boy who had added a secret ingredient to his family's recipe, a pinch of cinnamon. Caleb took his defeat with a stoic grace. But the good-natured ribbing from the whole town followed him for days. He had faced down Pinkertons, but he had been vanquished by a child with a spice rack. The next day, a new sign appeared next to Evelyn's water ledger at the spring. It was smaller, hand-painted by her. It read, "Notice the serving of coffee found to be bitter beyond the limits of established law is strictly prohibited upon these premises, by order of the management." Men who came to draw water would read the sign, look toward the bridge where Caleb was working, and chuckle. It was an inside joke made public, a small, intimate piece of their life shared with the whole community. It was a declaration that this quiet, formidable man was not just a laborer in their town. He belonged to someone. When his 6 months were up, the bridge was finished. It was a solid, handsome structure, a testament to a community's ability to mend itself. The irrigation ditch that ran from Willow Creek to the communal grazing pasture was also complete. Caleb's debt, as he saw it, was paid. A few of the men clapped him on the back. The blacksmith offered him a permanent job. He was free to go. He could get on his horse and ride away, find another horizon, another place to outrun the man he used to be. That evening, he did not show up at Evelyn's cabin at the usual time. She ate her supper alone, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She told herself it was his right to leave. He had earned his freedom, but the thought of the coming winter without his quiet presence by her fire was a cold and desolate one. As darkness fell, she heard a sound outside. Not the sound of a horse riding away, but the sound of an axe splitting wood. She stepped out onto her small porch. Caleb was there, at the woodpile. He had taken off his coat, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and he was methodically chopping and stacking firewood for her, enough to last for weeks. He did not say he was staying. He did not have to. Every swing of the axe was a promise. He finished his work and came to stand before her on the porch, the scent of fresh-cut pine clinging to him. The long, hard months of labor had burned away the last of the haunted drifter, leaving a man who was solid, centered, and at peace. "The school bell," he said, his voice quiet. "You still need a proper pull for it." He held out his hands. In them was the rope, the same rough rope that had once bound her wrists in cruelty, the same rope that he had used to pull her from the raging river. It was a symbol of their entire story, of the pain and the salvation, the bondage and the unbreakable tie. They sat together on the porch steps in the cool autumn air and began to braid it. Their hands worked together, his large and calloused, hers slender but strong. They did not speak as they wove the strands, turning a tool of violence and desperation into an object of hope. When they were finished, it was a thick, handsome braid, strong and beautiful in its new purpose. The next morning, before the children arrived, they hung it in the schoolhouse. Caleb gave the rope a final, gentle tug. The bell on the roof chimed, a clear, bright sound that carried across the morning mist. It was the sound of a new day, a sound of forgiveness. It was the sound of two people who had found their way home. The season was turning. Late autumn in the Montana Territory was not a gentle decline, but a stark and beautiful surrender. The sun, lower in the sky now, threw long, golden shafts of light across the valley, making the surface of Willow Spring glitter like a shattered mirror. The willows themselves were bare, their slender branches a delicate, gray lacework against a sky so clear and blue it ached. A V of geese flew south, their lonely calls echoing in the crisp, clean air. The world was preparing for the long sleep of winter. But for the first time in Evelyn Hart's life, the coming snow did not feel like an exile. It felt like the land was tucking itself in for a well-earned rest. Her cabin, built with Caleb's steady hands and the help of the town, no longer looked new. The sun and the wind had already begun to weather the pine logs to a soft silver, making it seem as though it had always been there, a natural part of the landscape. A thin tendril of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a sign of the life and warmth within. Near the small porch, a simple trellis had been erected, and from it hung Harlan's old lantern, cleaned and polished, its glass gleaming. That afternoon, Caleb and Evelyn walked back from the seasonal water council. It was a new tradition in Copperfinch, an idea Evelyn had proposed and the town had embraced. Every 3 months, representatives from the ranches, the town, and the Shoshone community met at the new bridge to discuss the fair allocation of water for the coming season. It was a simple, practical meeting, but it was revolutionary. Today, Tala Gray had been there, her presence a quiet but powerful statement of the new accord. She had spoken of the old ways, of how the streams dictated the movement of the herds and the people, and how taking too much from one place would starve another down the line. The ranchers, including Mr. Peterson, had listened with a new, sober respect. The arguments were not about ownership anymore. They were about stewardship. As they neared the town, they passed a crew of men working on the last of the irrigation ditches. Among them, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt, were several of the men who had once stood silently with Crowley. They were not being punished in a jail cell. Their sentence, handed down by the new Citizens' Council, was to contribute their labor to the very resource they had tried to help monopolize. Justice in Copper Finch had become a practical, tangible thing. It was the sweat on a man's brow as he dug a ditch that would water his neighbor's pasture as well as his own. One of the men looked up as they passed and gave a short, grudging nod. Caleb nodded back. There was no animosity, only the shared understanding of a debt being paid. Evelyn felt a quiet swell of pride, not in her victory, but in the town's capacity for change. It was a hard, unforgiving land, but the people in it were learning that the only way to survive was to hold on to each other, not just to their own small patches of dirt. They arrived back at the cabin as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air grew colder, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the coming frost. They worked together in a comfortable, practiced rhythm, Caleb bringing in the last of the chopped wood while Evelyn prepared a simple meal of stew and fresh bread. After they had eaten, they sat on the small porch, wrapped in thick wool blankets, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The silence between them was a warm, living thing, a space filled not with unspoken tensions, but with a deep and abiding peace. Caleb reached beside his chair and brought out a small object he had been working on for the past week. It was a lantern, much smaller than Harlan's, crafted from tin and bits of polished brass, its small glass panes perfectly fitted. It was not the work of a master tinsmith, but it was made with a patient, careful hand. He held it out to her. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, a perfect miniature beacon. "I made this for you," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet evening. "So when the storms come, when the snow is so thick you cannot see the porch from the woodpile, you can hang this up. I will see it." His words were a promise that he would always be out there, working, watching, and that this small light would be the thing that guided him home to her. It was a promise that he would never be lost again, because she was his fixed point in a turning world. Evelyn took the small lantern, its metal cool against her skin. She looked at it, then at him, his face illuminated in the soft twilight, the lines of his past etched into his features, but his eyes clear and calm. The woman she had been, the woman who had built walls of self-sufficiency to keep the world at bay, would have seen the gift as another tie, another potential vulnerability. But she was not that woman anymore. She had been untied, slowly and carefully, and in that freedom, she had found the courage to bind herself to another, not by law or duty, but by a choice made with an open and knowing heart. She set the lantern down and reached out, her fingers gently touching his cheek, his skin rough with a day's worth of stubble. He closed his eyes at her touch, a small, involuntary sign of his complete trust in her. "You do not need a lantern." "Caleb," she said, her voice soft but sure, filled with a love that was as solid and real as the mountains around them, "because you already belong to me." He opened his eyes, and in their depths, she saw the reflection of her own love, her own sense of home. He leaned in, and their foreheads touched. It was a new vow, spoken not with flowery words, but with a simple, profound truth. He had once confessed his belonging to her in a moment of desperate honesty. Now, she was giving that belonging back to him, a shared and equal possession. Later that night, they took a walk, their path lit by the rising moon. They followed the line of a new fence that enclosed a small pasture for their 2 horses, the one he had ridden and a gentle mare he had bought for her. The fence was another of their shared projects, a tangible boundary marking the life they were building. The air was still, and in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. As a slight breeze whispered down from the high peaks, it stirred the air in the town below. Faintly, So faintly it was almost a feeling rather than a sound. They heard a single, clear chime, the bell at the schoolhouse, rung by the braided rope, their rope. It was a sound of memory, of transformation, of a future built from the salvaged pieces of a broken past. Caleb put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, their steps falling into a single, easy rhythm. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest, and she smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. They walked back toward the cabin, a small, dark shape in the vastness of the prairie. From the trellis on the porch, Harlan's old lantern, which Evelyn had lit, cast a warm, steady circle of yellow light. It was a small light in an immense and overwhelming darkness. It did not conquer the darkness. It did not try to. It simply held its own small space, a beacon of warmth and life and stubborn, enduring hope. And for the two people walking toward it, it was enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.